Welcome everybody. Good morning. Sorry about my screen glitch there. I shared my wrong monitor, but welcome to the art of building a workflow.
Marisha, it looks like we might still be on the wrong monitor.
I am, you're right. All right, I think we're on the right one now. I apologize. Welcome to the art of building a workflow. My name is Roshan Khan, product consultant with Qualtrics. I've been here about 3 years, and we also have Tim Aiken on the call. You just heard from him. He's going to be fielding any questions that you all might have along the way. So if something comes up that's pressing, he might jump on camera and interrupt and field that question, and I'll be able to answer it for you. We'll also save some time at the end of today's session to grab any questions that might have come up along the way that might be better placed at the end, or if you just think of any questions towards the end, we'll be answering those at that point as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Who is this session for? This session is really designed for those of you that have somewhat of a basic understanding of workflows already. If you have been through an implementation and learned a little bit about workflows, then this is a great session for you. If you played around with any of our best-in-class workflows and have some understanding of how those work, this will kind of take some of that knowledge and take it to the next level. Or if you've just dabbled and played around with possibly trying to build a workflow yourself at this point, again, these are going to be some tips and helpful pointers and best practices to really take your workflow creation skills to that next stage and help you get the most out of the software. So let's talk about what some of the things are we're going to talk about today. I will go ahead and warn you, we'll be jumping around a little bit. This isn't so much a walkthrough on how to build a workflow. These are tips and best practices on various aspects on workflows to help you get the most out of the system. So we will be jumping around a little bit. I'll be doing my best to try to make those transitions as smooth as possible and really let you know, hey, we're jumping to a new topic now. I don't want to lose anyone. So I want to make sure I definitely alert you to when that's happening. So we're really starting talking about just the basic mindset you want to have before you even start constructing a workflow. What are some things you want to think about? If you do a lot of due diligence up front, it's going to save you some heartache in the long run. We're also going to be talking about some things centered around custom fields and some tips around how you might want to manage those. We'll then be jumping to responsible parties, and I'll be showing you a few ideas on how you can maximize the use of responsible parties inside workflows. We'll then touch on routes versus route exceptions. Really want to outline when you should use one versus the other. Possible circumstances where one might be a better choice, or where you might decide to not use one. We're going to then talk about the final step of a workflow. This is a commonly overlooked step, but there is a couple things you want to keep in mind with that final step, even though you don't always see that step. So we'll be talking about that. Dummy list fields for island steps. This is a little bit ambiguous. It's designed to be that way. You're going to have to stay tuned to see what that means and what that's all about. We're then going to touch on adding diagrams to a workflow. If any of you have used the Workflow Designer, you might be familiar with some of those steps, but we're going to be talking about more than just attaching it. And then we'll also touch on custom reports and reporting in general, and we'll be outlining a good tip to really get the most out of reports when it comes to workflows. All right. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into Qualtrics. Bear with me 1 second. All right. So inside Qualtrics, we're first going to start in the workflow design tool. I want to start here just sort of illustrating a workflow that we're going to be taking a look at throughout all of these points that I just mentioned. So this is a pretty simple workflow. This one's centered around a PTO request. I really wanted to keep it simple. I don't want you to focus too much on this specific process. I'm just going to be using this workflow to illustrate some of the tips and best practices that we're going to go over today. So with that said, let's talk about some steps you should take before you even start building a workflow. Sometimes that brainstorming and outlining process sometimes can be the more difficult and challenging part of workflow creation. So I'm going to give you a few tips to keep in mind as you're thinking about making your next workflow. So as you might know, workflows are comprised of 3 components for the most part. You have steps, routes, and custom fields. We're first going to focus on the steps and the routes. So as you might be aware, a step is a part of the workflow that can be assigned to a specific user. Question, Tim?
I think we're still looking at your PowerPoint.
Oh my goodness, I apologize.
It's all good. It's morning. It's early.
Let me stop sharing. My share window, my monitors are switched to what they normally are. I don't know why that happened, but everyone should now see a workflow inside the workflow designer. So I have the green bar around that, so it looks like that's correct. All right, so we're gonna first talk about how you want to think about creating steps and routes. So a step is a page on a workflow that can be assigned to an individual user or possibly a group or multiples of those things. Now, when it comes to thinking about what steps you want to have in your workflow, you really want to think about it in terms of responsible parties. That's really going to delineate as to when you might want to have a new step or possibly combine some steps that you've already thought of. For example, in this PTO request workflow, step 1, a user is going to request PTO. That's going to be one person completing that task. Then it's going to move on to step 2, where a supervisor is going to review that information. That's going to be a new responsible party responsible for that information. So it's pretty logical to have 2 separate steps. Now that's a pretty easy example. As you're coming up with new processes and workflows on your own that might be more complex, you should take a moment to ask yourself, who's responsible for this data? If the answer to that question is maybe multiple people at once, you might think about breaking that into multiple steps. Where conversely, if you have several steps that you've already designed where you realize the same person is filling out that information, it might make more sense to combine those into one step. These are not hard, fast rules, but a lot of times this is going to get you on the right track to have the most efficient use of steps as you're building a workflow. So really think about those steps in terms of responsible parties and who's going to be responsible for the data on those steps. Once you have flushed out the steps that are necessary for your process, you then want to bring your attention to routes. Now, taking a look at this diagram, the routes are the arrows that are connecting these steps together. And what thought process did you have with the routes? I've worked with a lot of customers building workflows, and to be honest, sometimes the most difficult part of building a workflow is just coming up with what to name your routes. It seems pretty trivial and it seems like it'd be easy on the surface, but you're not really thinking about route names when you're thinking about a process, and sometimes you can get stumped just thinking about a name. So what I usually recommend is think about the name of a route in terms of buttons. When you are on a step, the route name that is leading away from that step is going to be the name of the button at the bottom of the page. So all of those route names will be translated to buttons within your workflow. So you want that name to make sense for a user to want to click on. Also think about someone you might not be even familiar at all with your process. If they saw that label on a button at the bottom of the page, would they know what to click on? Would it make sense to them? Think about it in terms of action items. For example, on our PTO request, we are filling out the request on step 1. The route now says submit PTO request. This is sort of an action. We are clicking this button to submit this request. So those are just some tips to think about when it comes to naming your routes. I know that can be one of those fiddly type things where you don't really put a lot of time into thinking about it at first, and then it sort of becomes problematic later if you don't do your due diligence. So let's just kind of run through this workflow so we all know what we're looking at here, since we're going to be using this as an example. Step 1, we all know we're going to be putting in our PTO request. We're then going to be submitting that request to our supervisor. On step 2, they're going to be ascertaining whether they're going to approve or reject this PTO. They also might request additional information, which will take us down to this bottom step. If they do request more information, that user can provide it and then send it back up to the supervisor review. Hopefully at that point, they'll be able to approve or reject that PTO, which will then take us to a user notification step, which will notify the original user of the verdict of that PTO. And then at that point, they'll be able to close out that process. So quick outline here, we're going to jump into Qualtrics and take a look at the definition of this workflow, and we're going to continue talking about some of these points. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into Qualtrics. We're going to go to the Administration tab, and then we're going to go to Workflows. And I'm going to select the PTO request. This is the same workflow that we just saw the diagram for. And as you may or may not be aware, before you can work on a workflow definition or modify anything, we need to take it offline. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'm going to go ahead and click on step 1 so we can see our custom fields, which brings us to our next point. Some things to keep in mind with custom fields. If you've taken a look at any of our best-in-class workflows that Qualtrics provides to you, you may notice a pattern. All of our custom fields for the entire workflow process are listed on step 1. This one is no exception. I've done the same thing here when I constructed this workflow. We can see on step 1, PTO request, in new fields for this step. Every single custom field for the entire process is built out in step 1. That might seem a little strange at first, but let me talk about a couple reasons why this might benefit you. First, listing out all of your fields on step 1, you'll then be able to mirror every single step based off of step 1. So we can see we have the same list of fields here on step 2. If you go to step 3, we have the same list of fields here on step 3, as well as step 4 and step 5, which is the closing one. We're dealing with the same list of custom fields. So mentally, this makes it a little bit easier to deal with. We're not trying to juggle what steps are on or what fields are on what steps and which fields are not on certain steps. We're looking at the same exact list. So you start to be familiar with that list. You know where things are. Now, once you've built out all of your fields on step 1 and delineated all of them down to subsequent steps with the same list, all you need to focus on now is checkboxes. And checkboxes are a lot easier. So if we take a look at step 1, like I mentioned, we have this big list of all of our fields for the whole process. But if we look, only these first 5 fields are essentially turned on with these view and edit checkboxes, meaning these fields are viewable, you can see them, and they're also editable. You're able to enter data into those fields. So those are the only fields that you're actually going to see on this step in practice. Now, if we transition to step 2, the supervisor review, again, we have the same list of custom fields, but the way they're configured is slightly different. We have the first 5 fields from step 1 are still here. They're only viewable now. They're no longer editable. And then we have 2 more fields, which apply to the supervisor step, which are both viewable and editable. So we're sort of building on each other every step. And we always have historical data that we can see from previous steps as viewable. So the farther you get into this workflow, the more fields are going to be present. Granted, most of them will be read-only, since we're just looking at historical data that previous users had entered on previous steps. And all of the new information that's going to be collected is going to be towards the bottom. So it's going to be a chronological list that continues to grow as you go through each step. And this becomes more and more beneficial and important the more complex of a process that you decide to tackle. Again, this example is a little bit of an easier one, but as you start to build those more complex workflows and complex processes, I find that you'll most likely greatly appreciate building it this way. It allows you to keep things a little bit more organized. It's just easier to follow. And then for the users that are actually using the process, it benefits them as well by always being able to see the historical data up top, new information at the bottom. And we can actually see that in this workflow if I were to go run through it really quick. So if we go launch this PTO request, I can put in my name since I am requesting PTO. I'll then indicate when PTO starts and when it possibly ends. We'll just say tomorrow through Friday. And for the PTO reason, I'm just going to say going to the lake. I'm going to indicate myself as the supervisor. And then we're going to go to the next step by selecting submit PTO request. And this sort of illustrates my point here. We have all of our historical data from step 1 up top. You can see it's read only. And since I'm pretending to be a supervisor now, I can review that information. And then I could give my decision on whether I approve, reject, or need more information. So this is a common trend throughout this workflow. You're always going to have that historical data first, new information below. Definitely something I recommend that you all adopt in your own workflow construction. All right, let's go back to our workflow definition here. Our next point when it comes to custom fields is how you want to label your fields. You may have noticed already that all of my custom fields have a prefix. I have labeled them all with a PTO prefix. Some of you might do this already. Some of you might not. Some of you, this may have never occurred to you. That's totally fine. A benefit of doing this is to help you keep track of your custom fields. This is going to be more pertinent for those of you that have a larger organization where you might have many custom fields and many workflows. The more you can keep those custom fields organized, the more this is going to help you in the long run. So let's say, for example, let's say you're a customer that has 100 workflows in your system. Now that might be normal for some of you, or that might sound astronomically large to others. It's really going to depend. But let's say you have 100 workflows in your system. It's quite easy to imagine that you might have several custom fields that are duplicated among those workflows, especially with simple custom fields such as this one, supervisor. That's a pretty generic custom field that we can all imagine having the need to name a supervisor in many processes that you all deal with in workflows. And if you imagine having, 5 or 6 different supervisor fields in your custom field list, it starts to become difficult to differentiate between which one goes with which workflow. Now, some of you might use the same field across all those workflows, which is totally fine, as long as you know that you're using it for all of those workflows. Others might create separate ones because you might lock it down to certain groups. In that case, it would definitely benefit you to have a prefix on that custom field so you know which one goes where and where it's being utilized, especially in the event that you go to edit one of those fields. So I always advocate putting a prefix on your custom fields. Those of you that might be new customers, this is a great time to start doing that. That's going to really set you up for success in the long run. As you start to grow and build more workflows, you're not going to run into these issues if you start doing this from the beginning. So really saves you some time and effort down the road. You can really keep track of your custom fields, especially if you need to go edit one of these. If I needed to go edit a custom field that says reason, I might have a bunch of these, but now I'm just looking for the PTO prefix followed by reason. Much easier to find that and differentiate between this and other similar fields. All right, let's move on to another topic. We're going to be talking about responsible parties. A couple different tips here for responsible parties. Those of you that have built workflows or at least edited existing ones, that might be something that you have tweaked. Responsible parties are very common to adjust. Think about if you've taken any of our best-in-class workflows, those responsible parties are not set up out of the box. That's at minimum one of the first things you're going to adjust on one of those best-in-class workflows. But let's talk about another example. Let's talk about you building a brand new workflow process. There is going to be an element after you feel like you've built that whole process. You're going to want to test your workflow to make sure it functions the way that you imagined it would, and it covers all the bases that you need it to. If you build a process, more than likely, each of those steps is going to have a different target audience or responsible party in mind. When you're going through the testing phase, it could be a little bit time consuming going through that process because it's going to be sending that workflow out to all of those parties that are responsible for each piece of it. And then you're stuck waiting on them to fill out those fields, click on the route to go to the next step. And it could be a little bit time consuming to actually get through just one instance of that workflow, just for the purposes of seeing if it functions correctly. So if any of you have been in that situation, you may have seen that problem already, and maybe you've elected to just add yourself as a responsible party. That is definitely an option. So if you go to responsible parties, I could select any of my users and groups. Maybe I'll just select my own name here and add myself as a responsible party for every step. That way I'm able to work on it by myself. That is definitely a valid move and a beneficial one. However, that really just allows you to be the only one to work on it. Perhaps you want to pass it around your team and have anyone test it independently. And if that's something you want to do, I recommend that you use the workflow initiator option. So if we go to open options here for responsible parties, there is a checkbox that says workflow initiator. I go ahead and select that and add that responsible party. What that means is the person who started this workflow is now responsible for this step. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for each of these. This one's already set to workflow initiator, as well as the additional information step. I did not set that up on step 1, and in fact, it will not allow you to choose that for step 1. Step 1, as we know, is not the traditional responsible party that we see in other steps. Step 1 responsible parties indicate who has access to the process. So by leaving it set to all users, that means anyone in Qualtrics can start this PTO request. And then by having by having the workflow initiator listed as every field or every steps responsible party after step 1, what this really means is anyone who starts this process can work through the whole workflow independently on their own to do their testing. So if I go ahead and start this process now, I'll be able to work through every step. I can check all the custom fields. I can make sure the routes work correctly. The route requirements are there. All of those elements I can test. And then I can say, hey, Tim, do you want to go ahead and test this for me too? And he can go start the process and be able to work through that whole workflow himself as well. So utilizing that workflow initiator can definitely be helpful during the testing phase. Now, obviously, once you finish testing and flushed out any potential issues or pitfalls in your workflow and corrected them, you're then going to want to come back and go to all of your steps and make sure you select the correct responsible parties that are really going to be responsible for that data. All right. So that's a good way to test your workflows. Let's talk about another option with responsible parties. Once you've gotten past that testing phase, once you're ready to implement it and utilize it, you may come across some situations with workflows where you build a process and you know exactly who should be responsible for each step in that process. You might have a singular person in mind or a specific group, something like that, that's always going to be responsible for that data. That's a very nice situation to be in, but that's not always the case. Sometimes, depending on the process, you will have a step where the person responsible for that data could change from situation to situation, depending on what's going on. And that becomes a little bit more difficult to flush out, well, who should I add as a responsible party for that step if it could be different for each instance? And in those scenarios, you might be tempted to just add a ton of responsible parties to that step to cover all your bases. Maybe you add one large group, and depending on the circumstance, you're hoping that everyone in that group knows when they should jump in and fill out that data. Now, that's a big hope, and there's some potential issues that could arise there. You might have the wrong person filling out information if it's not the correct circumstances for them to do so, or you might have several people trying to jump in, and those are just it's a little bit clunky to do it that way. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for all situations. Sometimes it does have benefit to have a large group as a responsible party, but for this particular situation that I'm outlining, there is another option. So let's say for a workflow or this workflow, there is a certain step where the responsible party for that step is going to 100% change depending on the situation. This workflow has an example like that. A user is requesting PTO, and that user's supervisor is going to need to be the one to sign off on their PTO. Well, throughout many organizations, most employees have different supervisors, unless you're in a small organization where you have everybody has the same one. If you're medium sized to large size, there's lots of supervisors, and the system isn't going to automatically know who your supervisor is. So we can actually build that into the process. And that's what I've done here. On step 1, we're filling out your own name as the requester, your start date and your end date for your PTO, and then the reason for your time off. The last field on step 1 is where you actually indicate who your supervisor is with this personnel field. So you're actually picking a name out of a list of users inside Qualtrics and naming them as your supervisor. This might seem a little odd. I mean, obviously that person knows who their supervisor is. Why are we trying to collect this data? Well, by naming this person, this field can then be used as a responsible party for a future step. So since they are choosing this person on step 1, we can then go to step 2, and we can actually name that field the responsible party of this step. So if we go to responsible parties on step 2 and go to open options, we have all of our personnel and groups that we've seen before, and then we also have that workflow initiator option that I mentioned earlier. But we have another category, and that category is custom fields. These custom fields are only going to be personnel custom fields. And here we have that field that I just mentioned, PTO supervisor. We're going to go ahead and select this and add that responsible party to step 2. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the workflow initiator option that I added earlier, since that's no longer necessary. So now what we have is an actual personnel field listed as a responsible party. Sometimes this can be a little bit odd to conceptualize, but if you think about it, step 1, we are naming who our supervisor is. And the answer to that field, that person now becomes the responsible party of step 2. Now, whenever you decide to use personnel fields as a responsible party, there is a very common error that you might run into, or perhaps you already have. So let me demonstrate what that error is, and then I'll show you how to fix it. So if I try to put this online now, we are going to get an error. It says the PTO supervisor personnel field cannot be a responsible party for the supervisor review step because it's not editable in at least one step that leads to it. And that's the important piece. if you are using a personnel field as a responsible party, you have to allow someone to pick someone from that list before they're responsible. And in this case, I forced this error, so I made that not a possibility. So we have the PTO supervisor listed as a responsible party of step 2. If we go to step 1, we see that that field is only viewable. It's not editable. Therefore, there's not a possibility of someone selecting a name from that list. And since no one can choose a name from that list, the responsible party of the next step is just not going to function correctly. So if you ever do get that error, make sure that you go find where that field is previous to where it's being used as a responsible party, and make sure it's editable in at least one step. You might have it editable in several steps. That's totally fine, but it needs to be editable in at least one of those. So we'll go ahead and choose editable, and I'll save that. And we'll go ahead and put it online again, and you'll see that I do not get that error anymore. And just as a general rule of thumb with those workflow errors, it's very easy to sort of panic when you see that. If you just take your time and read through them, they usually tell you specifically what's wrong with your workflow and what to fix. So usually just take your time and read through it. You can usually figure it out. Obviously, definitely let us know if you can't, something comes up like that. All right, so those were a couple tips on responsible parties. Let's transition to routes versus route exceptions. So I'm going to go up here. I call this the outline view. If you hear me throwing that term around, this is what I'm referring to. This is where our steps and routes are listed out. So if I hit expand all, we can see all of our steps and all of our routes. Now on step 2, you see that we have 2 routes. One that says PTO reviewed, which takes us to the user notification step. We have another one that says more information needed, which takes us to this additional information step. So these 2 routes go to 2 different steps. Now in reality, there's 3 possible outcomes of that step. You can approve or reject the PTO, which is the PTO reviewed route, or that supervisor might need more information, which is this second route. So let's talk about a potential pitfall if you have it set up this way. So I'm going to go ahead and put this online, and we're going to go through this workflow one more time. So we're going to go PTO request. I'm going to select myself as the requester. We're going to say the start date is Wednesday through next Wednesday. So we're going to take a week off, and where are we going? I'm going backpacking, and I'm going to select myself as the supervisor. And we're going to go ahead and submit PTO requests. So now this second step is the step that we were just looking at in the workflow definition, where we have 2 routes. So if you look at the bottom, we have PTO reviewed and more information needed. Now this is the step where the supervisor is giving their decision on the user's PTO. So if we hit this drop down, PTO supervisor decision, we have the option to approve, reject, or need more information. So let's say, for example, that I choose, I need more information. And I'm going to say, where are you backpacking? So I have elected to request more information. I've made that clear by choosing that option in the drop-down list. However, let's say I mistakenly choose the wrong route. I should be clicking on more info needed, but instead I accidentally click on PTO reviewed. And that takes us to the user notification step. This is not where I intended to go. We wanted to go to this additional information step. So now I've made a mistake. So how can we potentially not eliminate, but minimize the chances of that happening? So let's go ahead and close this one out. Let's jump back into our workflow definition. So I'm going to take it back offline. And again, we're talking about this step 2 where we have these 2 routes. So first of all, I want to go ahead and eliminate the possibility of clicking on the wrong route. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and remove that more information needed route altogether. We're not going to have that as an option. So we're going to go ahead and remove that. Now your next question is, well, Roshan, if you remove that route, how can you get to that additional information step? We're going to do this a different way. So we're going to use what's called a route exception. So I'm going to click on our only remaining route on this step, which is the PTO reviewed route. And we're going to go down to where it says route exceptions. Now, what is a route exception? The name sort of explains what it is. It is an exception to the route. Now, it's not always necessarily an exception. It could just be an alternative or another option. But in this case, it truly is going to be an exception because this route is pointed to user notification all times. It's always pointed to user notification. We're going to build in a possible exception to where it won't go to the user notification. So I'm going to come to route exceptions and we're going to go to open options, and route exceptions are always based off of list fields. So I'm going to select this drop down, and these are the only 2 list fields in my workflow, and we're going to select the PTO supervisor decision. We want to route this workflow based off of a choice in this particular list field. So once you select your list field, it's then going to show you all of the available values that are in that list. We're focused on the need more info option. So I'm going to select that one, and I want to tell the system if the supervisor chooses this list option, I want it to go to the additional info step. I'm going to add that exception. So now what we have told the system is we've told it anytime you choose PTO reviewed as the route, we want it to go to user notification, except if the user selects need more info in that drop down. So let's go ahead and test this out and make sure it functions the way that we want. So we're going to go back to our PTO request workflow. I'm going to select myself as the requester once again. PTO start date, we'll say next Monday through Friday. And PTO reason, let's say I'm going skydiving. And I'm going to select my supervisor. And we're going to submit that request. Okay, so now we're on the step that we just modified. So you'll see there's no longer 2 route options. You only have 1, PTO reviewed. I'm going to go ahead and choose that same option I chose on the last example. We need more information. I'm going to say, where are you skydiving? So now I've selected more info and I'm going to choose PTO reviewed. If you remember the last time when I did this, it went to the user notification step. Hopefully this time it goes to the additional information step. So let's test it out. So I'm going to choose PTO reviewed. And if we look at our info at the top, we can see that the current step is additional information. So our route exception functioned correctly. And we could complete this by going to resubmit PTO, which takes us back to that supervisor review step. We're going to change this drop down to approve now. And I'll select PTO reviewed once again. And since I switched my drop down entry, it no longer goes to additional info. Now it goes to the user notification step. And then I can close out my workflow. So let's jump back into the definition. All right, so that illustrates one of the major benefits of using a route exception. Now you can add many route exceptions to a given route. I could make a new route exception for each value in that drop-down list if necessary. And that's something you might do in a more complex workflow where perhaps each option in that drop-down list might take you to a different step, going different directions. That's definitely a possibility. And sometimes you might prefer to use that instead of actual route buttons. Again, the likelihood of someone clicking on the wrong route is slightly greater than somebody choosing the wrong option in a drop-down list. So just keep that in mind. Typically, I recommend that you don't use a bunch of route exceptions in combination with a bunch of routes. It's not that the system won't allow you to do that. You definitely can. But sometimes it becomes needlessly complicated if you're using both. Not saying you won't run into situations where it might make sense to do that, but on average, I usually recommend using one or the other, whether that's a bunch of route options as buttons or eliminate those and use some route exceptions. That's usually the go-to recommendation for that. All right, let's jump to our next point and let's talk about our closing step. This is a commonly overlooked step. So if we click on the close step, we can see all of our custom fields that we've talked about already. So let's illustrate a point first before we do anything here. So if we go to advanced search and we search for instances of our PTO request, let's go ahead and select PTO request. I'm not going to worry about filtering anything right now. I'm just going to search for all of the PTO requests that I've run thus far. And here we can see all of our PTO request instances. Now, if we look at the current step, some of them are closed and some of them are in the middle of being processed. So let's first choose one of these that's in the middle of being processed. So if I choose ID 4217, and it takes us right into this workflow instance, and I can see all of the data that has been accumulated thus far in this particular workflow instance. And that's great. That's what it's intended to do. However, let's take a look at one of the closed workflow instances. If I click on ID 3787, which is a closed instance, there's no information here. And this might be something some of you have run into. This is a very common, I'm not going to say it's an issue because it's not, you did anything wrong and it's very easily remedied. But this is something that's very common that people run into. So how do you fix this? We don't really care about looking at this empty page. We want to see the data after this workflow instance has completed. And why is it showing up this way? Well, it's a pretty simple fix. If you go back to the workflow definition, if you take a look at any field in this or any step in this workflow, you'll notice that most of them have some viewable and editable fields on each one of those steps. However, if we click on the closing step, we have none of that. We don't have anything viewable or editable. And it's very easy to forget that because you never really see the closing step in practice when you're going through the process. The only time you ever see it is when you are doing an advanced search like I just did, or possibly pulling it up in a custom report. So it's very easy to just neglect to do anything here. Well, what I always recommend is going to your closing step and making all of your fields viewable. So I'm going to make all of these viewable and save my changes. I'm then going to jump back into my advanced search. And let's once again choose 3787 since that's that closed instance that I looked at earlier that was empty. So I go ahead and click on this. Now we can see all of the data from all of the fields that were filled out during that specific workflow instance. So definitely helpful, very easy to forget. Nothing to worry about though. If you do forget it, you can just go turn them on. You're not losing any of that data, as you can see. All I had to do is check those boxes and now the data appears. So it's not the end of the world if you forget to do that. It's easy to remember once you run that report or do that advanced search. If you see that empty list, that should just be a mental cue. Oh, we forgot to make those fields viewable in the closing step. Let me go ahead and do that. And then you could rerun that search and pull that data up. All right. So definitely keep that in mind for all of your closing steps on any of your workflows. Looks like we might have a question.
We do. We have a question. So, and you're on the perfectly right page. So the question was, the additional information step is highlighted in orange there, but the workflow is working. Is that okay?
Great question. So sounds like that person is possibly familiar with some of the errors that show up if you incorrectly set up a workflow. Lots of times when you see an orange step that's highlighted, it's usually an indication that something isn't connected right. More often than not, it means you don't have a route pointed to that step. Now, in this case, we don't really have a route pointed there, and that is why it's orange. However, we did build in that route exception, so the system does have an avenue to get to that step. It's just not the conventional means of using that route button to get there. So in this case, it's nothing wrong with it. It's just letting us know, hey, Roshan, you don't have a route going here. Maybe you want to consider doing that. But I already know that I have built in a route exception to get to that step. Now, if there was actually no way to get there, it would not let me put it online. So by putting it online, that's sort of your ultimate check to make sure everything's correct. This is sort of just a visual cue to, hey, let me double check this is set up correctly. But that put online button is really the end all be all when it comes to checking your workflow. And we're going to see an example here shortly where we're going to have another orange step and it's not going to let me put it online. So stay tuned for that. But great question. You don't always have to be alarmed when you see that orange color. A lot of times it is telling you something's wrong, but not always. So just keep that in mind.
Oh, and it looks like we have a part 2 to that
Okay.
one. And it looks like it might be just a public service announcement, a PSA. So when you add an employee to a field, you need that name there for the identity to see who the workflow applies to. But you also use that field as a responsible party. When that person leaves, you need to apply a different employee there. So yeah, I think that was just a call out that if you do assign it to an employee, you'll need to update that before moving forward.
Definitely. Yeah. Great point to make. What that user is saying is if you add an individual to a step as a responsible party, that person leaves the company. That workflow is kind of stuck at that point. That person's not there. That's another reason, if you've ever heard anyone from Qualtrics suggesting you use groups over personnel, that's a valid reason to use a group rather than an individual. If that person was to leave the company, and you're using a group, hopefully someone else gets thrown into that group to replace them, and the workflow will still function the way it's intended.
And we've got one other since we're right here.
Okay.
So the question is, can you use a route exception to go to a previous step rather than a new one versus having a route button altogether?
Definitely. So in both of those scenarios, a route or a route exception can always go backwards or forwards. Just keep in mind, you're never able to go back to step 1. You can go back to any middle step, but you can't go to step 1, since that would be in effect creating a new workflow instance. But yes, to answer your question, you definitely can go backwards.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Good questions. All right. Perfect. Okay, so last thing we talked about was our closing steps. So that was really all I had to share there. We're going to jump to that ambiguous item that I mentioned earlier, dummy list fields for island steps. And so the user that asked about this orange step, we're about to see another one, and that's probably going to work more how you might be used to seeing it, where it doesn't let you do anything. So let's talk about a scenario first that I can illustrate, and then we can show a workaround how to accomplish this. So If you've been playing around with workflows and you go into the workflow definition settings, you might be familiar with this expiration option or expires. And being familiar with Qualtrics, we all know that expires is another term for the system notifying you of something via your inbox. And this is no exception. If you have a workflow expiring, that means that the workflow can reopen at a certain future time to a step of your choosing and be sent to that person's inbox. So we're going to set that up here. Now, I am electing to not have this workflow reopen to one of our existing steps. I want it to reopen to a brand new step. I want a step that when this user is on PTO, I want the workflow to reopen on their final day of PTO, and I want it to reopen to a new step where they can potentially extend their PTO if necessary. So before we do anything, I want to go ahead and create that new step. So I'm going to go to where it says add a new step at the top, and we're just going to call this PTO extension. And it's going to be a regular step, so we're going to leave it set to user, and I will add that step. Now, when we do reopen to this extension step, I want it to then close out after that step. So we're going to add a route that takes the workflow to close from the PTO extension. So we're going to go to where it says add a new route. We're going to call this route close. And it's going to go from additional info. I'm sorry, not additional info. It's going to go to from PTO extension to close. And we're going to add that route. Now, just like any other step you add to a workflow, you need to have some fields to fill out as well as some responsible parties. So I'm going to go ahead and click on our new PTO extension step. I'm going to add a responsible party, and I'm just going to make it the workflow initiator for now. And then we're going to add in all of our fields from our previous steps. So I'm going to go to fields from other steps. I'll go to open options, and I'm going to click the box next to our first step, which is PTO request. If I expand that out, it has all of the fields for the whole workflow. We're going to add all of it. So I'm just going to check that one large box, and I'm going to list it as viewable for all of them. And I'm going to go ahead and add all of those fields. Now you can see we have all of the fields for the whole workflow. And we're going to talk about this last one. We haven't mentioned this yet, so I'm going to turn that off for now. And I already have these two fields built in, PTO extension for the time and PTO time extension comments. So those are going to be the two editable fields on our new step. So I'm going to make them editable and save my changes. All right, so let's talk about what we've done so far. I've added this new step. I've given it a route to get to close. Now we need to figure out a way to get to that step to begin with. If you've ever come across this situation, if you're kind of following the bouncing ball logically, your next thought might be, well, let's go to our workflow definition settings, and we're going to go to the expires option. We're going to turn it on. I want the workflow to expire, or in other words, reopen, based on our end date for PTO. So the PTO end date field. And then I want it to reopen to our new step, the PTO extension step. So we're going to go ahead and save that. And now if you think about this, it seems like it should work. We're going to go through our original workflow. We're not going to see that PTO extension step. The workflow is going to close out. And then whenever that PTO end date happens, the workflow is going to reopen. And then it's going to open up to the PTO extension step. We can add in that info if necessary, and then close out the workflow. It seems logical that it would work. Well, let's try and put it online. If we put it online, you'll see we get an error. PTO extension has no routes or route exceptions leading to it. So this is telling us that the system doesn't care that it's expiring to that step. There's no real route to get to it. So this is one of those examples where this orange step is sort of indicating a problem here. But again, the end all be all is going to be that put online button. That's really going to let you know if you have an issue. So how do we correct this? Well, we're actually going to use a route exception. You may have noticed, and I mentioned it a second ago, I have this field here, PTO, yes, no. I'm actually using this as quote unquote a dummy field. This is not a field that anyone's going to ever see. No one's ever going to fill it out, but it has a very important purpose. And that purpose is to make a route exception to go to our new PTO extension step. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on any route. I don't care what route it is, as long as it is a route that is prior to our PTO extension step. So let's just go to this user notification close route. And we're going to add a route exception by choosing open options. We're going to go to list fields, and I'm going to go to PTO yes or no. And we don't care what choice we make. Any of these, either one will work. So let's just choose yes. And it's going to navigate us to the PTO extension step. So what this means is if someone were to select yes on this custom field, it would take us to the PTO extension. Now that if is really a never, because we're not going to have this field editable or viewable on any step whatsoever. So we have sort of tricked the system into believing there is a conventional way to get to that PTO extension step. So we're going to go ahead and add this exception. And I can click on any of these steps. That field is not viewable or editable in any step in this process. So we can double check that. So now let's try and put it online and see if it works. You put it online now, and we should get no errors, and we don't. So now we have a way to get to this PTO extension step where we sort of fooled the system into believing there's a route to it, which there isn't. But it's still going to expire or reopen to that step when that PTO end date has elapsed. So very useful trick to utilize if you ever need to reopen a workflow to a new step that was not part of the original process. All right. Let's move on. Question?
Yeah, we've got one. So why do the workflow steps rearrange sometimes if we add a step the same way you just did? And how can I put the steps back in order?
Good question. So typically the steps are going to be arranged in the order in which routes are pointing to them. So you'll notice when you add new steps to a workflow, it's going to throw those steps up there, but they will become rearranged once you build in routes. And so they're going to go in a logical order based on the route. So PTO request, the route is submit PTO request, which takes you to supervisor review, which is next in line. Then PTO reviewed route will take you to user notification, which is the next step in line. And then close is going down to close. Now these two steps that are orange in this case, they have route exceptions as a way to get to them. So those are typically always going to be at the bottom of the list because there's not a conventional route pointing to it where the system can put it in that logical order. So when you're using route exceptions, that's just something you're gonna have to get used to. It might be in a sort of a funky order compared to what you're used to. And that's just because there's not a conventional route for it to put those in that sequence that you might be used to. So just be aware those are always gonna be towards the bottom. Good question. All right, let's move on to our next point, and that is adding diagrams. So if we take a look at our workflow design tool, this is the diagram I showed you at the very beginning. There are two ways to use this tool. You could use it to create a brand new workflow, which will then attach this diagram to that new workflow. And then we have a paperclip where we could attach this diagram to an existing workflow in the system. Some of you might be familiar with this already. This is not what I'm talking about when I say attach a diagram to a workflow. Once you have done this, all it does is attach the diagram to the workflow definition, which is right here. We have an option to view that diagram. It's going to download an image. You can take a look at it. That's pretty cool, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not very helpful. We don't really care about looking at the diagram now. We want to see it when we're actually working on the workflow. And the examples I showed you earlier, you saw the workflow in the footer. Sorry, you saw the diagram in the footer of your workflow. How does it get there? That's what I'm about to show you. So if you take a workflow offline and go to workflow definition settings, and then go to the HTML headers and footers option, you can see here I have an HTML code. Now, I don't expect any of you to just make this HTML code unless you're very familiar with HTML. But if you take a look at any of our best-in-class workflows, they all have this code built into them. You would come to the same place, HTML headers and footers, under the workflow definition settings. The only thing you'll have to tweak on this code to get it to work is this numeric value, which is the ID of the workflow. Now, if you're stealing this code from another workflow, it's going to have the ID of the workflow you're taking it from. So you're going to want to remove that ID and put in the ID of the workflow that you're adding it to, which in this case, you can see at the very top is 3757. And so we can see that that matches my code, and that lets me know that this HTML code works. And so once I add that code, add the HTML code and add the ID and save it, it will then show up in your footer like you see here. And that brings us to the end. And we should have a couple minutes for questions if there's any last minute questions.
We don't have anything pending right now. I'm going to give it just a little bit and make sure that nothing else comes in.
Okay.
We do have one. So can you paste that code into the chat for this presentation? We absolutely can. Or if you are, if you're in the user conference site, there is, if you go into the document tree, there's a folder down at the very bottom that says Tim's Creative something. It's a folder that I made. I can't remember exactly what I called it. But there's an HTML examples document in there. And that code is in that document. So you could get it straight out of that UC site too. But it looks like the chat's going to close here pretty shortly anyway. So I will, that came in from Sarah. Sarah, I will email that directly to you if you'd like. Otherwise, you can grab it out of the user conference site.
All right.
I believe that is all that we have right now.
Yep. Okay. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you all. I hope you learned a lot, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you very much, Megan. Appreciate the help.
Thank you. Great job.